So I don't really need to make a video about The Exorcist, right? Let's quickly run through what that would be like. Blah blah William Peter Blatty novel. Blah blah greatest horror movie of all time. Something something pea soup. Yada yada first horror film to ever be nominated for Best Picture. But you know what I don't see a lot of people bring up? The sequels. Including prequels, made-for-TV films, and associated work. There are actually 7 films in the Exorcist series. All of them are pretty much revolved around people possessed by the same demon, as he basically body hops from one host to the other. And most of them are pretty bad. But not all the sequels were way ahead of the time when the Exorcist series was actually relevant. The first sequel was actually released in 1977, and it was called The Heretic. Aside from the fact that Linda Blair reprises her role as Regan McNeil, it's an absolute mess, and it's widely considered to be one of the worst films ever. In fact, it was such a failure that it took another 13 years for another Exorcist movie to be made. But if you ask me, it was worth the wait. Exorcist III follows Lieutenant Kinderman from the first Exorcist as he investigates a series of mysterious, religious-based murders in the areas of Georgetown. The murders seem reminiscent of another killer from years back known as the Gemini, and even though he was executed, Kinderman is convinced that it's the same guy. However, one of the men in the hospital's psychiatric ward claims to be the killer himself, and as he investigates, it turns out to be...
It's a wonderful life.
Holy shit, it's Damien Karras. Damien has been catatonic since the exorcism of Regan McNeil, and the spirit of the Gemini killer has been inhabiting his body, getting stronger and stronger until he was able to possess others and commit murder. So Kinderman is charged with finding the vessels that the Gemini is using to kill others, and getting the spirit out of Karras once and for all. I've talked before about how I'm not the biggest fan of exorcism movies. They tend to be mostly the same and they don't really add anything different, but Exorcist III is perfect for this type of film, and it's mostly because of the pacing. It changes everything up. It's an exorcism movie second, and a supernatural suspense thriller first. It's almost like a satanic cop drama. The main character, Lieutenant Kinderman, is not a major part of the first movie, but he was a pretty important part of the novel, and Blatty wanted to make him a more prominent figure in the sequel, so this whole movie revolves around him. His investigation, his friends who are being murdered, his family that's at risk, and his faith that's being tested. As a bitter cop for so many years, Kinderman isn't convinced that there's a heavenly light looking over anything, especially since a few of the people killed were members of the church and Boy Scouts.
There you go, blaming God.
Who should I blame? Phil Rizzuto?
You wouldn't want to live forever.
Yes, I would.
No, you wouldn't. You'd get bored.
I have hobbies.
Speaking of which, nothing in this movie makes me happier than the scenes involving Kinderman talking with his priest friend, Father Dyer.
I don't know you.
You're reading Women's Wear Daily?
So what? Am I supposed to give spiritual advice in a vacuum?
Their conversations are so natural and funny, and they're entertaining as hell. Whether they're talking about life and death, whether or not God exists, making carp for dinner.
I haven't had a bath for 3 days. I can't go home until Carp is asleep.
And seriously, in what other movie can you hear a priest quote Mel Brooks?
Go in peace, my child. May the Schwartz be with you.
I was genuinely upset when this guy died, on a level that hasn't really reached me in a horror film in years. That's how good of a character I thought he was. I was legit depressed.
What are they? What's in them?
Father Dyer's entire blood supply.
There isn't a lot of on-screen brutality in the movie. There's just enough implied gore and described horrors that you don't really need to see it, though. Having it explained to you is just as disturbing.
Then the killer stuffed her body with other materials and sewed her back up.
Let me give you 2 clear-cut examples to what makes this maybe a different level of scary than the original film, but still just as good. Let's start by talking about jump scares. When I think of jump scares as a concept, the first word that comes into my mind is cheap. Because I'm one of those people who doesn't associate being startled with being scared. You can be surprised by anything. You can be surprised by the sound of fireworks going off in the distance. But you can be genuinely scared by an image that stays on screen and forces you to look at it. Also, because I'm so jumpy, I get more mad at myself than I get scared of what I saw. So in order for me to admit that a jump scare is good, it has to be really good. So let's talk about this scene. You're jumped into the hospital setting right away, and you don't really understand what it means at first, but you know it's nothing good. It freezes on this one static shot for a lot of the runtime. This scene lasts an incredibly tense 5 minutes, and here's basically what happens. The nurse checks on a patient, she sorts through some paperwork, goes to check on a dimly lit room, and everything falls into place. She's left alone in the halls after the security guards leave, the lobby is quiet, and then... God damn it, that's good. This movie takes some simple elements and puts a nice twist on it to make it that much more enjoyable. And that's why my favorite scenes in the movie are the scenes where Kinderman actually talks to the spirits inside Damien.
Are you Damien Karras?
You haven't any medical records for him, have you? No tedious fingerprints?
Even if you're not going to watch the whole movie, I really recommend that you check out these scenes. In the first one, it starts off with you only seeing Damien on face value. And that's the same actor from The Exorcist, Jason Miller. And hearing him say all of these terrible things is really a bit of a shock.
I still hear from her occasionally, screaming. I think the dead should shut up unless there's something to say.
He brags about killing boys and priests. He talks in riddles about a certain master on the other side, and he roars. And here's the thing, that is not the craziest sound that comes out of his mouth, especially when he reveals his true form.
The Gemini is dead.
No, I am not! I'm alive! I go on! I breathe! Look at me!
Ladies and gentlemen, Chucky. The spirit of the serial killer is played by Brad Dourif in what I would argue is his greatest acting role ever. The way he talks to Kinderman, bragging about how great he is at killing people, how much joy he takes in his work, his desire to be noticed for his efforts, he is the perfect psychopath.
I like plays. The good ones, Shakespeare. I like Titus Andronicus the best. It's sweet.
Titus Andronicus. Okay. For those of you who aren't theater nerds, Titus Andronicus is the story where the hero kills his enemy's children, puts them into pies, and feeds them to her.
Why, there they are! Both baked in that pie whereon their mother daintily hath fed, eating the flesh that she herself hath bred.
That's his favorite Shakespeare play.
It's the smiles that keep us going, don't you think?
But don't let the soft-spoken moments really take you out of Brad Dourif's performance, because there are some things that really stick out about this for me.
Damien.
No!
I love how he says that the spirit isn't alone in there. He's one of many. He is legion. So depending on what he's talking about, his tone of voice changes. He can be sophisticated and calm. He can be temperamental and desperate. He can sing opera.
Do you dance?
What do you mean?
That is arguably one of the scariest things I've ever seen in my life. And in probably the greatest moment of all, when he discusses his plan to use Karras's body.
As he watches while I rip and cut and mutilate the innocent, his friends, and again.
In case you didn't catch on, Satan holds grudges. So the entire plan of this is that as Karras was about to leave his body, the Gemini killer's soul was swapped in, keeping him contained in there.
He is inside with us! He will never get away! His pain won't end!
So once he's strong enough to actually use that body, he's gonna keep Karras hostage, watching all of the acts of terror that he's going to commit in his body. Not just as the body of himself, but the body of a religious figure. The body of a priest. That's a whole nother level of messed up.
Then, of course, no one notices. Pearls before swine.
Okay, if you've watched any of my other videos, especially the Wicker Man one, I haven't exactly kept it a secret that I worship the works of Christopher Lee, and I think he's one of the greatest people who ever lived. I have kind of a similar reaction when it comes to George C. Scott.
You magnificent bastard, I read your book!
Although I haven't seen everything he's been in, he's without a doubt one of my favorite actors of all time. He is my favorite Scrooge, he's my favorite fictional and non-fictional general ever portrayed on screen, and he's low-key my favorite Disney villain.
It's time you learned how to fish for crocs. Ain't like it when you use live bait.
As a fan of his, I can admit that he kind of plays himself in every role he's ever been in, but it's a good person to play, and he does it very well.
That would be in the file.
It is not in the file. It is not.
He's one of the few actors on the planet who can have the same expression in 5 different scenes, and you still know exactly what's going on in his head. He doesn't need to ham it up in this series, he just needs to give it the right reaction at the right time. So for most of the movie, he's his same stoic self, and there are times where it's necessary for him to emote, and he lets loose.
Every possible ugliness and corruption, you son of a bitch! I believe!
Now, this movie is often considered an adaptation of William Peter Blatty's novel, Legion. And that's not exactly true. Blatty actually wrote Legion as a script first, and he wanted the original director of The Exorcist, William Friedkin, to helm the project, but Friedkin and Blatty fought so much over how the film should be presented that he left and the movie went into development hell. And it was shelved for so long that Blatty honestly thought it would never be made into a movie, so he just released it as a novel. Now, when it was finally being considered for production, it came down to 2 companies that really wanted to make the film. One of them was Carolco Films, and the other one was Morgan Creek. A representative for Carolco brought up the idea of the movie being, instead, about a grown-up Regan McNeil giving birth to twins, both of which would be possessed. He realized he was talking to crazy people, so he signed with Morgan Creek pretty much immediately. Now, that's not to say that the final script didn't have any changes, because there was originally going to be a backstory with a Gemini killer involving an alcoholic father, and once he dies in the story, Gemini willingly gives up because he was just doing it to impress Daddy, which is lame. In my opinion, that's really kind of lame. But the biggest change is that the original ending of Exorcist III didn't have an exorcism.
Come in, Father Morning. Enter, Night. This time you're going to lose.
The entire movie is kind of built up that it's going to come down to a final showdown between Gemini and Kinderman, and it's a lot more satisfying if it plays out as a one-on-one confrontation. But Father Morning shows up almost completely unannounced, and the film jumps into a, guess what? Exorcism time!
Right prayer.
Give us this day our daily bread.
Do you think they will save you now as before?
And forgive us our trespasses.
Well, I can pray too.
I've gone back and forth on this one, and I honestly don't know which I prefer. The original script would have ended in a tense Mexican standoff between the demon and Kinderman, eventually ending with Kinderman winning. But at the same time, you kind of get the feeling that the demon can't be killed by traditional means. It needs a little bit of Jesus in there. Plus, it gives us a great few visuals at the end that wouldn't have been there in the original script. And even if Blatty didn't want to direct them, he did, and it came out gorgeous.
Bill, now! Shoot now! Kill me now!
Some of the story does feel kind of out of place, and I feel like the studio interference is entirely to blame for that. I have a feeling that if Blatty had his way the whole time, we could have had a slightly better picture. George C. Scott and Brad Dourif seem to be on his side with this. But I want to know whose idea the nurse in Kinderman's house was. Because that was bad.
Catatonics are so easy to possess.
I can defend a ton of this movie. There's so much of this that I like. But this scene is where it totally shifts in tone and becomes laughably dumb. More so than the scene where the woman's crawling on the ceiling.
Spider-Man does whatever a spider can.
Because in the same movie where we have this incredibly tense scene,
In this body in particular, in fact,
Ooh, let's call it revenge.
And we have this incredibly shocking description.
The place of his head was the head from a statue of Christ, all done up in blackface, like a minstrel show, you know.
We have a scene where an elderly woman is possessed by the devil, tries to cut a girl's head off, fails because her grandmother pulls her out of the way, and the ending turns into kind of that witch fight from Army of Darkness. If anybody wants to step forward and claim responsibility for that, I will accept your apology, because this is garbage.
Oh, Bill. My God!
I'd like to see a restored director's cut of this movie, but that's probably never going to happen anytime soon. So, we'll have to take a couple of bad scenes in exchange for what's really an interesting approach to exorcism movies. It's got brilliant visuals, great performances, and genuine tension. It's also got George C. Scott, Brad Dourif, and Jason Miller absolutely commanding the screen, an exorcism with practical gore effects, and a few crazy dream sequences with Fabio showing up for no goddamn reason. And Samuel L. Jackson, too. Wow, he really is in everything. So while it's not in the same league as the original Exorcist, it doesn't try to be. And that's for the best. Please check this one out. Highly recommend it. Spiriti Sancti. In nomine Patri Filii. The rest of that Boondock Saints quote, I don't know.
We won, Bill. Now free me.
Next time, we're going to take a step away from Satan, and we're going to take a look at the movie where monsters are defeated not through the power of prayer, but through alcohol.
Is it dead?
I think it's just resting its sleep.
It's one for the sea and it's one for the